Well, thank you for joining us today. My name is Nathan Stelter. I'm the president here at the Stelter Company and excited for you to join us for our webinar, Raising Major Gifts of Assets During a Pandemic, with our good friend, Dr. Russell James. I'll get back to Russell here in a quick minute, but before I do, I'll say a few words about our webinar series. Many of you, I think, are familiar with what Stelter's been putting forth the last 4 or 5 years as an industry leader in the space and marketing. You know, we've been committed, long committed, to providing solutions and resources and education to this industry in hopes, as kind of like they say, as the tide rises, so will all boats in the harbor. And so we're very happy to host this complimentary webinar today, as we do every year. While we haven't officially released our 2021 series, be on the lookout in your inbox over the next month or so for that announcement, as we're excited about the lineup that we have for this year. Now back to today, and Russell and Dr. Russell James, man who really needs no introduction. I think many of you probably have heard him at one point or another, or seen him as we were chatting. We're both very excited at some point to get back in front of folks and not do this remotely, but it is what it is. And as we all know, we're pivoting and navigating this appropriately this year. So we appreciate Russell's time. He is currently serving as professor, Department of Personal and Financial Planning at Texas Tech University, where he directs the on-campus and online graduate program in charitable financial planning. He graduated cum laude from University of Missouri School of Law, where he's a member of the Missouri Law Review and received the United Missouri Bank Award for Most Outstanding Work in Gift and Estate Taxation and Planning. Also holds a PhD in Consumer Economics from the University of Missouri, where his dissertation was, appropriately enough, on charitable giving. He's got a long storied career. I think one of the things I appreciate most, not only is Russell so kind and generous with his time and his insights, I think I speak for a lot of folks, so the plan giving industry is much better off today than it was before Russell started sharing his insights. I think he's done some tremendous work. But having been in the plan giving shoes, having been the president of a school, and now being on the academic side, he just brings such great perspective to the work that he's done and the work that he knows we're all trying to do. And so I will pass it off to him today, and I will give you the controls for the next hour or so, Russell. The stage is yours.
Great. Thanks so much, Nathan. I really appreciate that. So today I'm going to be sharing some ideas about raising major gifts of assets during a pandemic. And we're going to be looking at some new strategies for the new world and also some concepts that have been useful for a long time. So in looking at this, we're going to first take a look at the why question. Why focus on major gifts of assets? And then after we spend a little bit of time looking at the research results on the why, we're going to get into the nitty gritty. We're going to get into the how, and we're going to start out pretty simple. How do you raise these gifts in a simple version? And then we're going to get kind of increasingly complex and wonky as the hour goes along with some interesting strategies, especially strategies that are brand new in the sense that they are much more powerful or for the first time available today. So why not just use the easy button? Look, I understand asking for cash is easier. You don't need the hassle, right? You don't need to worry about helping your donors. That's somebody else's job. It's easy to think, I don't need to do all this hard work to become a competent advisor or learn about new things or provide value to donors. But let me tell you, there's lots of reasons why asking for gifts of assets makes sense. Let me explain a little bit about why that is. First, when it comes to gifts of assets, planned giving becomes really powerful whenever we've got appreciated assets. That is, whenever we have something that is worth more than the donor paid for it. And one of the things to notice, of course, in last summer, we experienced a dramatic drop late spring in the stock market. But even during the time when the stock market was down, it was still up from, if you go back 3 or 4 years before. So do keep in mind that just because we occasionally will have negative volatility, that doesn't mean that you don't still have donors who own assets that are worth more than they paid for them. And that's the key characteristic that makes charitable planning so powerful. Of course, not everything even had that drop, right? I mean, Amazon's done fine, Walmart, pharmaceuticals, farmland, gold, Clorox was a big winner last year. Who would have thought that? although I guess we all should have actually put our money into AMC and GameStop, but that's a whole separate matter there. I also want to suggest that there are some special one-time opportunities for 2021 in the US. Now, we're going to talk about why these are so powerful in a bit, but the current Section 7520 interest rates are near the lowest in history. And in 2021, we can eliminate 100% of income with charitable deductions. The fourth reason to focus on gifts of assets is, well, it's pretty simple. It's because that's where the wealth is. So when we look at national data from census on the financial assets that are held in families, a very small share, depending upon how you define cash, a very small share is held in checking accounts, saving accounts, money market deposit accounts. Where the wealth is actually held is in stocks, bonds, retirement accounts, life insurance, mutual funds. That's not even considering real estate on top of all of that. So that's really where the wealth is. And that's important not just from a mathematical perspective, but also from a psychology perspective. Because you see, when you ask for a gift of assets, it actually changes the reference point for the gift. So the idea is this. We know that wealth is not held in cash, it is held in non-cash assets. So when you ask from the cash bucket, well, the natural comparison point is other things you spend cash on. That is other pocket change or disposable income expenditures. If you ask for gifts of cash, you're sort of accidentally asking from the small bucket. Whereas if you ask for gifts from wealth, the comparison point is, well, if you ask for a gift of stock, I naturally compare that to my portfolio, a much larger reference point. And so that can make a difference. Asset gifts can feel relatively smaller because of the comparison point. The comparison point is so much larger, so the gift feels relatively reasonable. There was one fun experiment that showed the power of just reminding people of their assets. In this experiment, people were coming into a grocery store before they were going grocery shopping and asked if they wanted to participate in an experiment. And if they did, then, well, half of them were simply asked about what was in their wallet or purse. Did they have any cash or credit cards? And others were instead asked about, do you own any stocks? Do you own any bonds? Do you own any certificates of deposit? Simple yes, no questions. But as a result of being reminded of whether they own stocks, bonds, or CDs, those people actually on average spent 36% more in their subsequent shopping trip. So it just points out that when we're reminded of our wealth, it changes behavior. And we actually see this in experiments with charitable giving. People who feel wealthy, and reminding people of their assets helps them to feel wealthy, those people act more charitably. So it is these feelings that are actually most important to predict charitable giving, not necessarily just the objective wealth amounts. And that's why reminding people of their assets, of their wealth, can be so powerful in a charitable giving space. Another reason is because when we start talking about gifts of assets, it makes wealth donation relevant. So this comes back to a concept from behavioral economics. In fact, a couple of years ago, Richard Thaler won the Nobel Prize in economics in part for this concept of mental accounting. Now, mental accounting it's basically just the idea that people attach labels to financial assets and then they treat those assets differently. Now, this is important when it comes to fundraising because once a donor makes a gift out of an asset, makes a gift out of wealth, it actually labels or classifies that asset category as donation relevant for all of their future gifts. And so that can actually be transformational for their charitable giving. We actually see this in experiments that if you label a donation as relevant for multiple budget categories, it increases donations than if it's just relevant for one category. The seventh reason to focus on these kinds of gifts is that people are actually more generous with appreciated assets than they are with regular earned income. This is something we know from actually a whole series of experimental results where in the lab we find that people are much more likely to spend unearned gains versus regular earned income on luxury goods in general, but on charitable donations is in in particular. And one of the reasons that that is so powerful is that when we make a gift out of unearned gains, that is out of appreciated asset, that makes it an exceptional event. And because it's an exceptional event, we don't compare it with our regular weekly or monthly budget. We don't compare it with other regular disposable income expenditures. And that allows that gift size to become dramatically larger because it changes the category of the gift size. Now, to dive a little bit deeper into the sort of sociology underlying this, there's also another powerful factor, and that is that gifts of cash, or actually cash in general, is antisocial, whereas gifts of objects are pro-social. Reminders of cash in experiments, they actually promote independence motives, exchange and market motives, and as a result, reminders of cash actually reduce willingness to help other people, and they even reduce willingness to make donations. Now, in comparison, gifts of objects are actually pro-social. We see this going back to one study that's about 100 years old now from Marcel Mauss on the idea of how people think about gifts of objects very differently. These gifts of objects are pro-social. They're common in social relationships, and they emphasize community norms rather than exchange relationships or exchange norms. Think of it this way. Look, if you were to invite me over to your house for a fancy dinner, it would certainly be appropriate for me to say, thank you so much for going to all the trouble of putting this on. I brought a bottle of wine. I hope you enjoy that. It would not be as appropriate for me to say, thank you so much for going to all the trouble of putting this together. Here's a $50 bill to help with your expenses, right? There's something that is socially appropriate that emphasizes communal and social norms about the gift of an object that isn't true for a gift of cash. The eighth reason to focus on these gifts of assets is that, well, it changes the fundraiser relationship. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is this. If you are promoting non-cash assets in order to have those conversations, it really helps to know a little bit of information. It helps to develop a little bit of technical skills. By doing this, you can actually transform the relationship with the donor from one of simply asking to one of providing good ideas. In other words, one of advising rather than asking. Now, I know Stelter has a lot of great resources for how to learn about these gifts, and in addition to that, if you actually just go to YouTube and type in Russell James Planned Giving, I've got a series of 65 planned giving videos that are animated videos that go through all of these, and only about say 17, 15 minutes a piece. So if you did one of those a day, give it a couple months, and you'll be an expert. And at the bottom of the slide there, that's the direct link to that list. So you can develop that technical expertise to be able to have these conversations along the way. And this is an area where I think one of the reasons why asking for gifts of assets is so powerful is that it reflects real donor-centeredness. You see, nonprofits that promote non-cash gifts, they're actually willing to increase their own hassle, because frankly, cash is easier for the nonprofit to deal with, but they're willing to increase their own hassle in order to benefit the donor. And that's dramatically different because that's not just donor-centered happy talk. Now, look, you go to any AFP meeting, you're going to hear a lot of donor-centered happy talk. This is different. This is action, not just talk. This is where the rubber meets the road, and that kind of action can make a dramatic difference when it comes to donor gifts and behavior. What do I mean by saying that gifts of non-cash assets are better for donors? Well, we can just start with the numbers, right? Appreciated asset gifts are objectively cheaper for the donor. Donors can give more at the same net cost. Why is that? Well, very straightforward. If a donor writes you a check, the maximum benefit from that check is a tax deduction. Maybe they can use it, maybe they can't. Not that many people are itemizing these days. But if instead the donor makes the same gift as a gift of an appreciated asset, they get a tax deduction of the same size. And on top of that, they get to avoid capital gains taxes. And that benefit they can use regardless of whether they're itemizing or not. Let me give you a quick example. Let's suppose a donor was going to write a $100,000 check to your organization. On the federal tax level, and of course state taxes will add to this in some places, but at the federal level, that gives you a maximum benefit of $37,000. But if instead you give an asset that, say, was some stock you bought for $10 a share, now it's worth $100 a share. If you've owned it for more than a year, you give that asset, you get a tax deduction of the same size, and you get to avoid $21,240 of capital gains taxes. So that is something that is very powerful, especially because that last benefit, you can get that whether or not you're itemizing taxes. The ninth reason to focus on these kinds of gifts is, well, frankly, because if you don't, someone else won't, or at least not how you want it. What do I mean by that? Look, you might want to take a hands-off approach and say, I don't need to learn any of this stuff. They've got financial advisors. I don't need to be at that table. I don't need to be part of that conversation. And here's why I want to recommend that you do need to be part of that conversation. Understand that many financial advisors don't know charitable planning, but even those that do, you have to understand their incentives. Financial advisors are compensated based upon assets under management. And believe me, if you want to increase assets under management, charitable planning instruments can be fantastic ways of doing that. You can take an asset, you can sell it with no capital gains tax, you can grow it in a tax-free environment, you can take not only the lifetime payments from it, but you can have it then pay out to the donor's own private family foundation or donor advised fund. So you can keep managing those funds for multiple generations in a tax-free environment. That's a great way to increase assets under management, but not necessarily a great way to get resources to your organization to advance your causes. So that's why we need to be part of that conversation rather than just washing our hands and leaving it to the advisors. The 10th reason to focus on these kinds of gifts is because fundamentally it drives long-term fundraising growth. And this is something that's no longer in the realm of just ideas and war stories, because we've been able to do an analysis over 6 years of data of over 1 million nonprofit tax returns to see who's growing and who's not growing. And let me just give you a quick comparison from that analysis. By the way, if you're interested in the details of this, just connect with me on LinkedIn. I'll send you the link to the full academic paper as well as all my other slides and presentations and papers. But here's one quick comparison. We looked at organizations that were raising at least $1 million a year to start with, and then we wanted to see how much were they raising 5 years later. And the only difference is we looked at organizations that at the beginning and at the end were raising gifts from cash, and at organizations that at the beginning and at the end were raising gifts, including gifts from securities. Now, those organizations raising gifts from cash, on average, their combined total growth over 5 years was 11%. That's the same as the inflation rate combined over that 5-year period. In other words, those organizations, they're just treading water. Organizations that instead were consistently raising gifts from securities, their total contributions growth rate was 6 times larger. 6 times larger just from that one factor. Very powerful factor. By the way, did it matter? We're looking at that particular 5-year period. We in fact looked at every 3-year period, 2010 to 13, 2013 to 16, and in between, and it did not make any difference. It was the same set of results. Was this because these organizations were larger? No, in fact, when we looked at organizations within different size categories in terms of their size of fundraising contributions, we saw the exact same result. Whether organizations as small as raising only $100,000 a year, all the way up to organizations raising $10 million or more, organizations raising $50 million or more, or in one analysis, organizations raising even $500 million or more, seeing this same kind of result. We also see not just a matter of it being yes versus no, you're either doing some securities or real estate gifts or none, but as organizations shift more towards contributions of cash, total fundraising goes down. As they shift more towards contribution of securities, total fundraising goes up. It's true with real estate as well. Now, not all non-cash assets were the same. If you're raising gifts from non-cash assets that are small, like books or collectibles, uncategorized, it is pretty much the same as cash. But as you got into those categories that represented more wealth, like real estate, publicly traded securities, non-publicly or privately held securities, that's where you got the really big impact. All right, so hopefully I've convinced you of how that this is a good idea to raise gifts from non-cash assets. Now let's switch and let's start talking about how do we do this, and in particular, how do we do this now? So let's start simple before we get into some of the complex, wonky things a bit later. Do keep in mind that in this time, with all of the crazy things we've been through, it's best to start with showing support. Now, we know this from, for example, just reality, social, friendship, family relationships. Those are relationships that actually encourage sharing. What we know from a lot of experimental research is that transactional market exchange relationships, those don't encourage giving. They don't encourage sharing. So we want to start social whenever we start the connection. So the first contact or the first part of the conversation is we're going to start with concern. We're going to start social. But how then do we change that? How do we then move the conversation into gifts? Well, one way that I like as a conversational approach is simply permission marketing. Now, by permission marketing, what I mean is, we simply bring up the topic and then follow that by silence. So for example, let's suppose I'm talking with the donor and the donor asks I ask how things are going with them. They ask how things are going with me. I might say something like this. Well, the family's doing well. Thanks for asking. We've just had a lot of enforced family togetherness, but we're getting by okay. And I've still been busy for work, mostly talking to people about how to give smarter with all of this market volatility and the new tax benefits. So it hasn't slowed down. Taking a drink there, right, for a bit of silence. So the idea is I've brought up the topic, I've mentioned some benefits, how to give smarter, new tax benefits, and I've created some silence. That gives the donor, if they want to, an opportunity to then follow up. What tax benefits are you talking about, or what are other people doing with all of this market volatility? And then we can begin having those conversations along the way. Do keep in mind that crisis, and we've been through a lot of that over the last less than 12 months, it's not all bad for fundraising. Crisis creates opportunities for donor heroism. So we need to be creative about ways in which the donors can be the heroes in the situations that have been created by the various crises we've dealt with. Now, having said that, I do want to make one very important warning. One-time special requests work great, but you got to be careful with the crisis. And the reason I say that is this. If you send out a request based upon an organizational crisis, that'll get you the $50 gift today, and it will do so at the cost of the major or transformational gift in the future. People do not make major lifetime investment gifts to unstable organizations. So it's fine to have an appeal that is a crisis for the beneficiaries or a crisis for the cause, but be careful about suggesting that it is a crisis for the organization's survival, because that will get you into this permanent cycle of the desperation cycle and outside of getting those major transformational gifts. So along the way, one of the areas where planned gifts can become so powerful is as a plan B. Look, we've got so much craziness that's been going on in the last 12 months. You're probably going to have donors that are going to need to back away from a gift that you might have thought otherwise they would have said yes to, or maybe even back away from a commitment that they've already made. If we don't know The planned giving instruments, we just simply have to walk away from that with nothing. However, planned giving gives us a plan B. We can lean into that uncertainty by bringing up other opportunities that deal with the concerns, the financial concerns that the donors may have. Look, this can start as simple as a gift and a will. A legacy gift is revocable, of course, and it goes up and down with the ups and downs of the donor's wealth. And it's a gift that only is made after they personally no longer need the money. Irrevocable plan gifts can also help with financial uncertainty. So for example, a donor that expresses concern or has to back away from a gift because of financial reasons, we might respond like this: I certainly understand your concerns. I know others in your same situation who've decided to move their commitment into an estate gift for now. That provides flexibility with no upfront costs. There's even ways to do it that provide immediate tax benefits. Would you be interested in learning more about these options? So again, we've got a donor that's backing away from a gift. We now go to the plan B. Why do we want to go to the plan B? Well, here's one reason why that plan B is so powerful. You might think that, well, if you get a donor to include a gift in a will, well, that's nice for someday future way down the road, but actually it's nice for right away. And here's why. For most donors, the first time they will commit to a gift, a charitable gift out of their wealth rather than out of their disposable income, is when they commit to a gift in their estate plan. And notice how transformational that is on donors' current giving. So this is from a law review article published just within about the last 6 months, looking from a nationally representative study at adults over age 50, looking at adults who added a charitable component to their estate plan and comparing their giving before they added that charitable component to their current giving after they added that charitable component. And it's about a 77% increase, and it's sustained not just 2 years later, but even 4, 6, even 8 years later, there's this sustained increase in their current giving. So it's a transformational event for current giving when a donor adds charity into an estate plan. By the way, in some other analysis, it also increases propensity to make gifts of $1,000 or more, even propensity to make gifts of $10,000 or more. So very powerful when we can accomplish that. Okay, now I know what some of you are thinking. For those of you who are not used to asking for a gift in a will, it can be a little bit nervous, right? You might worry about how do you actually talk about this. If you're nervous about asking for a gift in a will, let me just share with you one of the easiest ways to do this. I like to call it the 4S method, for 3 stories and shut up. And what might this sound like? Well, suppose I was fundraising for Texas Tech and you were an alumnus. What might this sound like? Well, at some point in the conversation, what's going to come up is, so what's new at Texas Tech? Well, we're really excited about our new basketball coach. The tournament got canceled last year, so I guess we're still national runner-ups, and got a great recruiting class as well there with basketball. Lots of new building on campus. We're over 40,000 students now. If you come in the west side, you'll see where that construction is taking place. Oh, and Mary Smith did a neat thing. Now, did you know, Mary, she graduated 2 years before you? No, well, Mary spent her career helping other people get their finances in order. And she recently signed a new will that one day will endow a permanent scholarship for our financial planning students. If you can see the visual, I'm taking a drink, right? Creating that space in the conversation for the donor to follow up. Now, if you've got a donor who doesn't want to talk about these issues, of course, they're going to follow up with something like, oh, that new building, where would I park? And you might think, oh, it didn't work. But actually, we've tested message after message as to what is most powerful at changing donor attitudes about making a gift in a will. And actually, it's this: sharing a story about a living donor like the person you're talking to who has made a gift in a will. Very powerful, even if the donor chooses not to continue the conversation at that point. So very simple way you can learn to tell 3 stories and shut up. All right. What about gifts of assets? What's a simple way to ask from the big bucket? Very simple concept, very powerful concept. Oftentimes, you have a donor, you bring up the idea of, hey, do you have any, say, appreciated securities or other appreciated assets you might want to give instead of making this cash gift? And the donor says, yeah, but I really want to hang on to those shares of Apple stock. Not ready to sell those yet. You do not have to change your portfolio at all. You can simply do what I like to call the charitable swap. So let's say you had a donor that was getting ready to write a check for $100,000. We said, no, 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 don't use that check, don't use that cash to make the donation. Instead, give $100,000 of appreciated securities from your portfolio. Use the cash to immediately purchase identical shares in the same company. So you had 100 shares of Apple stock before you made the gift. You have 100 shares of Apple stock after you make the gift. The only difference is those shares are brand new shares that you just bought today, which means they have no capital gain in them. You have completely wiped out the capital gain from your portfolio, but you haven't changed the portfolio at all. So this is a way to get the donors into the idea of giving from gifts of wealth. And just a quick side note here, you can do this in the same day at the same moment because this is not lost property. We never donate lost property. And if it's lost property, we actually have a wash sale rule that would require us to delay when we would do this. If you've got a donor, or maybe you're working for a nonprofit that says, oh, I don't want to take gifts of securities or any of that sort of thing, that's fine. Even if you've got a grumpy CFO, you can just have the donor run it through a donor advised fund. And so the charity out at the end simply receives the cash, but the donor can do the same charitable swap and most importantly, get used to making gifts out of assets. So what predicts who's going to donate non-cash assets aside from wealth, that is having the asset? One study showed that it was high income, high education, and being age 65 and above. By the way, tax incentives are very powerful in general in current giving, but they are in many cases 10 times more powerful when it comes to giving stocks, bonds, or mutual funds. So very important to mention this when we're talking about gifts of assets. So how do we talk about gifts of assets? Should you mention tax benefits? Well, let me get on a bit of a soapbox here because as a researcher, nothing drives me crazier than this, which is you'll have someone that says, hey, we want to know why donors give money. So we'll send out surveys, ask them, why do you give money? And there'll be all these reasons, very compelling, like I want to change the world or because of my values or because that's how I was brought up. And then one of the reasons will be because I want tax benefits. And nobody checks the tax benefits box. And so that's fine, except the problem is people will take that result and say, oh, well, so you shouldn't talk about tax benefits. That's not how we can test that. We have this issue when it comes to people self-reporting. They're going to give you the most socially desirable or socially approved answers, okay? So we can't test that in that way. Instead, how you test it, of course, we know that tax benefits matter just from national economic data, but you can also test it this way. Here we randomly assign people to one of two descriptions of a gift of stocks or bonds to charity and asked them how interested they were in making this gift. And it turns out they're much more interested in avoid capital gains tax by making a gift of stocks or bonds to charity than by just making a gift of stocks or bonds to charity. This is a separate group of people. We randomly assign them to one of three descriptions of a charitable gift annuity, and again, the same result. Lowest interest with no reference to tax deduction, higher interest if we put it at the end, and even higher interest if we put it at the beginning. We actually then rotated this group, so the top group became the bottom group and vice versa, and then we did the same test for a description of retained life estate. And if you don't know what that is, then watch those videos or we'll talk about it in a minute. We got the same result. We spun the wheel one last time and did three descriptions of a charitable remainder trust, one with the description of the tax deduction brought almost all the way to the front, and one with it brought all the way to the front, and we see the same positive effects. What are some of the best phrases to describe the tax benefits? In this experiment, we asked people what they wanted to read about on their favorite charity's website, and it turned out there was no magic phrase as long as you did reference the tax benefits. It was a little bit better to talk about avoid taxes rather than avoid capital gains taxes because simple words work better. Now, do keep in mind that the tax benefits aren't the reason for the gift. They're not the motivation. We do want to mention it, but the motivation is pro-social. Hey, how can I convince the board that this is important? Well, I'll tell you what I did when they gave me the opportunity to talk to the Texas Tech Foundation. I pulled up one of our competitors who was doing a better job than we were. Very motivational to show someone, a competitor who's doing a better job. This is another university that's also in our same athletic conference, doing a much better job than we were at non-cash assets. How can you do this? This is all public information. This is from the IRS Form 990. All charities have to file this. Just get online. Lots of website, GuideStar and others, it'll give these to you for free. Start looking at your competitors. This is Schedule M. Find a competitor that's doing it better and use that to motivate leadership to make a change, to make a difference. By the way, if you're accepting non-cash gifts, those are way safer today than they ever have been in the past. If you're accepting them directly into your charity, we've actually got new instruments like the Single Asset LLC that helps protect the charity from any liability from those assets. And if you've got a really grumpy CFO that says, oh, we don't do real estate, or oh, we don't want to do securities, there are donor advised funds now that will accept any type of valuable asset. So again, you can start with your local community foundation, but if it's too weird for them, there are lots of organizations like Charitable Solutions with Brian Clonst's group and others that will take any kind of valuable asset. And I'm talking everything from unharvested crops to a partial interest in a racehorse to, in one example from one other donor advised fund, a elephant ride business in India that had to be held for 2 years before it was sold, right? So what I'm telling you is that if a donor has something valuable, please don't bring me your timeshares. If a donor has something valuable, the answer is never no. The answer now may simply be, yes, we can do that. We'll just run it through this donor advised fund. Let me show you how you can do that. So again, much more powerful. All right. That's how we ask for a gift in a will or a gift of securities. Now let's get kind of wonky, okay? Because I love this stuff, right? How can we raise these gifts now in a complex version? Well, one of the things that you may want to keep in mind is this. With this year, just like last year, current gifts, we can deduct up to 100% of income with current gifts. Now, because of that, it creates a special opportunity where, let's say you've got a donor who's made, say, a 4 or 5 year commitment. Well, if they decide to pay that pledge in cash this year, they can use that whole deduction. And that's very important if they're doing other things that cause their income to spike, such as doing a Roth conversion. If we have an IRA, the money in that IRA grows tax-free, but whenever we pull it out, we got to pay taxes on it. If we take that traditional IRA, we convert it to a Roth IRA, then any of that money we pull out and any growth on that money, we get to pull it out tax-free. Very powerful financial planning strategy, but it creates a big tax bill. Whenever we do that conversion, if we convert $1 million standard IRA, we're going to have $1 million tax bill. We can offset that now even up to 100% by making a gift in this year. Let's talk about charitable gift annuities. Charitable gift annuity, that's just where a donor makes a gift to your organization and you give back lifetime income. And these are the example rates that are currently in effect. And as you can see, especially during our low interest rate environment with older donors, this may be particularly attractive. This is for donors who say, I want income that won't change or run out. Now, we did see in the last period of market volatility, a lot of very large charitable gift annuities being issued just because of that security being backed by the organization. So if we've got a donor who's worried about income or other issues, we could say, I certainly understand your concern. I know others like you who have decided instead to make a gift that gives them lifetime income. With interest rates being so low and the market being so volatile, many people like the fixed payments coming from a charitable gift annuity. Would you like to learn more about this? Or if you'd like, you can even describe a charitable gift annuity as a two-stage gift if your organization offers it. Oh, I certainly understand your concerns. Another donor was in your same situation, and she decided to protect against all this volatility by making the gift in 2 stages. First, she made a gift that gave her annual payments for life. If things go downhill, she has that income. But if everything turns around and she ends up not needing the extra money, she can then donate those future payments as a second gift. One of the things to keep in mind is that if they're funded with cash, gifts, charitable gift annuity gifts should be able to eliminate 100% of income in 2020, and that rule has now been carried over into 2021. And again, if you're interested in that, connect with me on LinkedIn. I'll send you the full technical paper on that. One side note here. If you've got a donor that can't use deductions, right? We've all got a lot of donors that aren't itemizing these days. If they're not itemizing, the low interest rate environment that we're in, they actually make gift annuities much more tax attractive to them because the low interest rates make each payment a larger share of that payment is going to be tax-free to them. So it is actually a great environment for donors that aren't using the tax deductions. By the way, there's a study from American Council on Gift Annuities comparing organizations that dramatically increase their issuance of gift annuities versus organizations that dramatically decrease the total dollars of their gift annuities. And it turns out, here was the difference between those two types of organizations. The organizations that grew their share of gifts funded from cash, their share of gift annuities funded from cash actually went down dramatically. Vice versa, organizations that did poorly, their share of gifts funded from cash went up. So again, we see the same result that if you're focused on getting gifts from non-cash assets, very powerful. Now I want to share with you a kind of an obscure, wonky technique, really powerful right now in these days, and that is the retained life estate in a home or any farmland. So what is this? Well, very simply, a remainder interest gives the organization the right to own the property after a set time, or typically after the death of a person. However, unlike a gift and a will, once you record that deed, it's irrevocable. The donor can't change their mind. Must be done by a deed, can't do it by trust or contract. But when you record that deed that gives the inheritance rights to the charity, you get a dramatic, especially because of the low interest rates, immediate income tax deduction. So let me give you a quick example as to why interest rates are so powerful with this. So if you were to have made donated the inheritance rights as an age 55 donor to $1 million of farmland, that would have generated for you in a high interest rate environment a deduction of about $122,000. In our current interest rate environment, that's a deduction of $900,000. Now, just as of 2 days ago, the November rates, you can use them for November, December, and January. We're into February, so instead of 0.4%, we're looking at 0.6%, still looking at a deduction of about $900,000. I just want you to wrap your minds around the insanity of that for a moment. The deduction that an age 55 donor gets for donating the inheritance rights is only about 10% less than the deduction they would get from actually donating the real estate right now today, okay? Crazy opportunities that are being created by the interest rates. Now, of course, this is an irrevocable gift. Once they record the deed, they can't change their mind. That's why they get the immediate tax deduction, but also the charity owns that inheritance rights outright. You can also do this with a personal residence. In fact, you can even do it with a second home, vacation home, even a boat with bathroom, cooking, and sleeping facilities, as long as the donor occasionally uses it as a residence. So do keep in mind, required minimum distributions are back this year, but beyond that, donors can always give up to $100,000 directly out of their IRA. Those donors are 70 and a half or older. So the limit is not the required minimum distribution. The limit is $100,000. Again, we've got to be working with IRAs or IRA rollovers only. So if they've got a 401k or 403b, they've first got to roll that over into an IRA rollover. They will have to take the RMD in the year that they roll it over, but then from that point forward, they can pull out those qualified charitable distributions and they will count against the required minimum distributions. Now, a quick note here, of course, RMDs don't start until age 72, but we can start these kinds of gifts at age 70 and a half. So do make sure your donors know, even though they're not 72 yet, they can still make these kinds of gifts that are tax sheltered, because this is income they've never paid income taxes on, and now they never will. Another powerful strategy, especially in this interest rate environment, is the non-grantor charitable lead trust. This is an estate planning instrument. This is for avoiding estate taxes, so only for wealthy donors. The way it's set up is this: a donor takes an asset, they put it into the trust basket, the trust pays out to the charity for a fixed number of years, and anything left over at that period of time goes to the donor's heirs. Now, we do this to avoid estate and gift taxes. How does it do that? Very simply this: when you move the asset into the trust basket, you immediately pay gift taxes on the present value of the amount that is projected to go to heirs. You pay nothing on the amount that actually goes to the heirs. So this is important, because if the actual amount is higher than the projected amount, that part goes to the heirs tax-free. Now, here's why this is so powerful right now. The projected remainder assumes that for the life of that trust, 10, 20, 25 years, whatever it is, those assets are only going to grow at the initial 75/20 rate. That is the initial 0.6% rate. If the actual growth over that 20-year period somehow beats 0.6%, all that extra growth goes to the kids' estate and gift tax-free. So just to give you a quick projection, I apologize, 2 days ago we could use the 0.4% rate. Now we've got to switch to the 0.6 rate. But let me give you a quick example. The projected remainder, if you were to put $10 million into one of these trusts at a 0.4% rate, where you're paying out to the charity $521,000 a year for 20 years, the projected remainder is $0. That's what would be left over if your money actually grew for 20 years only at 0.4%, okay? Which means when you put that asset in there, you pay $0 in gift taxes, because $0 is projected to go to the heirs. But guess what? If your actual growth was not 0.4%, but it was 8%, what's going to be left over? Well, about $23 million. $23 million that all goes to the heirs completely tax-free. You see how powerful this technique is, especially if you've got a client or a donor who is already going to be making these gifts. Now it secures those gifts. They're guaranteed to be made, but it's kind of a tax-free, no-cost chance at a tax-free transfer to family members. Some other things, you can also use this if you've got somebody that can't use deductions because they've already given too much and they're over the limits on those deductions. It's another way where the trust itself can actually use those deductions. Now, there's another instrument called a grantor charitable lead trust. Now, this is actually not for super wealthy donors. This is for regular old normal Joe donors, because this creates an income tax deduction. So the way it works is this: a donor sets an asset aside, puts it into one of these trusts. Same deal, where that trust is going to pay to the charity for 5 or 10 or 20 years. Anything left over, though, comes back to the donor. The donor gets the asset back at the end, or whatever's left with it. Now, the deduction that you get is actually an immediate deduction for all 20 years worth of that giving. The size of that deduction depends upon interest rates. In a high interest rate environment, the deduction is only about half what it is in our current interest rate environment. And you can actually do these transactions fairly affordably. There's one group at iclat.net that does a high volume of these. They do them for a very low transactional cost, or of course you can use local counsel. But this is something to keep in mind. Very powerful, creates a big immediate tax deduction for all of those future years of giving. Well, that's a little bit about some different ideas, some wonky ideas. I'd love to talk more about some of these things, and hoping you have some questions, comments, or thoughts along the way that we can talk about now. So I'll go ahead and stop and turn it over, see if we've had any questions come in.
Sure, thanks, Russell. You do have a couple of questions. We have a little bit of time, so if there's more questions out there that you want to go ahead and send in, go ahead and do that. And I think Nathan might be joining us again. We'll see. Let's start with Peter's question. Peter asks, are certain types of estate inclusion more indicative of future lifetime giving?
Great question, Peter. The answer is A, I have no idea because it wasn't in the data. But B, I do believe if I was going to predict that the percentage gifts are always the more powerful gifts than the dollar gifts. Now, one thing to keep in mind whenever we're working with donors is as much as possible, we want to encourage them to leave a gift of a share of their estate. We don't really like those dollar gifts because oftentimes those gifts aren't going to come to fruition for, it may be decades. And what $100 or $1,000 meant a few decades ago isn't what it means today. So because of the risk of inflation, we would really prefer the percentage gifts. It is also the case with these percentage gifts. I know a lot of times people worry about, the donors might use up their estates and there may not be that much left over at the end, so we don't want the percentage gift. Look, all of our money, the dollars, all of our money comes from relatively wealthy donors, okay, say top 10% wealth holders, okay. Among the top 5 or 10% wealth holders, the wealth as they age, it does not go down during retirement. As they start hitting age 70s, even 80s plus, actually their wealth accumulation rates, they actually increase. They just keep getting wealthier and wealthier. So another reason why we want to go for those percentage gifts long term. So again, look, as a professor, I love having questions that the answer is I don't know, and I'm still going to take 5 minutes to answer that question because I want to talk about other related things. But great question. I wish I could answer that one with the data.
Thanks, Russell. Here's one from Lynn. She's wondering if you expect any changes with DAFs during the Biden administration.
So here is my rule about predicting what's going to happen with legislation. I lived through a year in which the estate tax disappeared completely for 1 year and then magically came back the next. And I went through 10 years of hearing how, yeah, there's this sunset clause, but that's never going to happen. Congress wouldn't allow some nonsense like that to take place. And guess what? Congress did allow some nonsense like that to take place back in 2010. So I don't make predictions for what's going to happen in that space. I know there's a lot of talk about wanting some minimum level of payout expectation with the donor advised fund. Don't know if that is actually going to be put into legislation or not. So apologies for not being in the prediction game on when it comes to what's going to happen in Washington.
No problem. Nathan, did you want to share a question?
Yeah, we've got a couple questions here, actually one from Charian here locally, and not a prediction per se, but just any thoughts or advice around lots of uncertainty that's circling right now on fiscal policy shifts with regards to capital gains. And so with an expected inflation increasing based on monetary policy, are there changes to better options for individuals or families to give, or what strategies would you suggest for nonprofits or fundraisers with regards to inflation?
Yeah, so great question. Some of the things to keep in mind, number one, obviously, if you've got a donor who is in an estate tax situation, we know that we can protect all of that estate growth tax-free by using something like a charitable lead trust. So if you're expecting inflation, you want to lock in that 0.6% rate today. You want to lock that in for 20, 25 years so that all of the extra growth transfers to the heirs tax-free. Hey, if you're worried about capital gains taxes, make sure you get those donors switched over to where they're not making gifts of cash if they have appreciated assets to give. You want to go ahead and get those capital gains out of the portfolio. No reason not to do it now, so you're not as worried about those capital gains taxes along the way if the tax policy were to have changed. So just some strategies for the future. If you think these things are going to change, now's the time. Talk to your donors about, hey, you've got some farmland you want to donate the inheritance rights to, or some residential residence. Do it now, because if we're looking at inflation, those deductions are going to get a lot smaller if inflation takes hold.
We have an interesting kind of a different question come from Robert, and I'm thinking Nathan might have some ideas about this too. Robert's asking, if an organization is hiring a new plan giving director, what would you recommend is the best background for that person to have? Would it be financial planning, a legal background, or something different?
So here's my prejudice, and I'm saying this as a tax attorney. My prejudice is this: if you give me someone who is good at talking to people, who's an interesting person to talk to, right? If they have that emotional intelligence, if they have those skills, they might scream and suffer a lot, but I can beat the tax law into them, right? You can force them at a point of a gun to watch my videos, and second or third time around, they're going to get it. They might hate it, but they're going to get it. And that person can be a dramatically powerful transformational fundraiser. You give me a tax attorney, CPA type, there's nothing I can do to make that person a good fundraiser if they're not good at talking to people and convincing people. So my view, and again, this is coming from somebody who trains financial planners and who teaches occasionally at the law school, my view is you got to hire the fundraiser first, and then we can beat the tax law into them. And the important thing too is what we find in all of the experiments is that if you just use those technical wonky tax terms like tax lawyers like me love to do, that doesn't work very well with donors. You've got to get somebody who can understand the concept and then translate it into simple words and stories. And that's what people who are good at talking with others and having those social relationships, that's what they're good at doing, is translating those concepts. So that's how I would hire.
I know we're getting close to the end of the hour here, but I wanted to chime in there too. I 100% agree. I mean, I think, we've seen that trend in the industry. I see a lot of plan giving directors that aren't quote unquote technicians, but they are amazing relationship builders. They're great listeners. And that is so critical. And I think, obviously your videos, and when things change, I know you do the course on campus as well. I mean, there's some great ways to get it. I think the other side too, Robert, with this position is that role an administrative role? Do they have portfolio? Again, if it's more internal, sure, having a technician may make more sense as a kind of a product expert. But at the same point, you can learn the nuances of the technical. It's the people skills that are harder.
Okay, great. We are out of time. Unfortunately, we probably have about 15 questions here that are left unanswered, but Russell has offered his email address. If you guys would like to reach out to him personally, it is on the screen there, russell.james@ttu.edu. Feel free to reach out to him. He also mentioned his LinkedIn page. You want to look for Encourage Generosity. I think that's in the link to your LinkedIn page. The other thing was your videos. People are asking again where to find those. I believe those are on your YouTube channel. Is that correct, Russell? Right.
Yeah, that's right. Or just connect with me on LinkedIn. I'll send you links to all the stuff I've ever done. It's all free, so happy to share it with you.
He's got so much stuff.
He will.
So much stuff. So, right. So anyway, if you have more questions, contact Russell. If you have questions about Stelter or our webinar series or anything like that, you can contact Nathan or myself. One of the most often asked questions was, is there a recording? Can we give a handouts? You went through the slides too fast. I need to see those slides. So yes, the answer is yes, absolutely. We recorded it and we will be putting the recording and the handouts on our website within the next couple days. I always send an email out to everyone and let you know once they're there. They'll be at stelter.com/webinar. So check that out in a couple days or just wait for my email. Thanks, Russell, so much for being here this last hour. And believe it or not, he's going to do it again at 2. So I think we'll log off and we'll have some lunch and then we'll be back. So thanks everyone for joining us. Have a great afternoon and we hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.